Hello everyone, and welcome back to Age of Noob. If you've been around any of the social platforms lately, you'd know that there's been a ton of discourse about the names of the newly announced Civ variants, as a significant portion of the community have not been too fond of the naming convention. I normally stay away from making these type of videos, mostly because it's often just senseless drama and rage bait trolling, but this one's a bit different. I figured that adding a bit of context for you folks could help both sides and hopefully reduce some of the abrasive language being used by a select few. Well, at least that's the plan. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. In case you missed it, check out my latest video on the newly announced civilizations. The relevant part for this video is that 4 variant civilizations were announced on top of the already announced Japanese and Byzantines, which are the Empire of Jade, Sultan's Army, Order of the Dragon, and Jeanne d'Arc. This is where this split begins, so let me tackle each issue one at a time and attempt to reduce some noise. The first 2 points I'll mention is mostly raised by a small, loud minority that shouldn't be taken seriously. The third, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated, so let's begin. Number 1. The Civ variants are just a reskin, and the devs are being lazy by making Civs like AoE2. Unequivocally false. This is the type of stuff you hear from molding redditors who are making baseless assumptions out of thin air. Ignore this noise completely. As I've mentioned in my previous video, each Civ variant plays very differently. We can't share more, but you'll have to trust us on this one. In fact, I personally prefer the Civ designs of the newly added 6 Civs compared to the original 10 we have in the game. Maybe I am biased because they're new and shiny, but I do think they are very fun to play with. Number 2. AoE4 is becoming more fantasy heavy. Generally untrue. Once again, this stems from people making assumptions without knowing anything about the new variant civilizations. In fact, some people looked at the Order of the Dragon name and thought that there's some mythology behind it, which is just untrue. Let's clarify. If you do a quick search, you'll find this immediately. The Order of the Dragon was a monarchical, chivalric order only for selected higher aristocracy and monarchs, founded in 1408 by Sigismund of Luxembourg, who was then King of Hungary and Croatia and later became Holy Roman Emperor. It was fashioned after the military orders of the Crusades, requiring its initiates to defend the cross and fight the enemies of Christianity, particularly the Ottoman Empire. As you can see, this has nothing to do with mythology, and the Order of the Dragon makes sense as a variant of the HRE. Now, you can make the argument that this isn't really a civilization like the rest of the roster, but that's a separate topic I'll address later in the video. I cannot comment much about Empire of Jade without getting into details, which I can't unfortunately. Jeanne d'Arc is obviously a well-known historical figure, and the Sultan's army seems to be a vague subgroup based on the Abbasids, of course. Now, if you're one of those who considers the Mongol Khan's abilities as fantasy, then yes, there are some abilities that will tread the surreal. This was a part of AoE 4 from day one, and is why I started this section with generally untrue. To summarize though, no, AoE 4 is not going to become Age of Mythology, and any claims like this is blown out of proportion. Number 3, and this is the biggest topic really, the variant civilizations have poor names chosen and should be changed. Let's open up this can of worms. Usually, problems like these are overrepresented due to a very loud minority, just like points 1 and 2 I just mentioned. Because this is often the case, it is also easy to mistakenly ignore problems by assuming that every backlash is due to a minority being loud and obnoxious. In other words, it's easy to assume that people are malding for the sake of malding. But is this truly the case for this point as well? Thankfully, we can cut through any bullshit by looking at the numbers, so let's talk stats. In the official forums, a poll with over 220 voters overwhelmingly chose to change the Civ variants' names at over 92%. On Reddit, a poll with over 580 voters chose to change the names at 66% and 84% if we include those who wanted to change at least some of them and keep others. These 2 polls are okay, but they have some flaws. First, their options are in absolute terms, which is not ideal to get the true sentiment of the voters. And 2, the population of voters is obviously skewed towards enthusiasts due to their respective platforms, and both of these polls have likely captured very few casuals. That's why I started a poll of my own in Age of Noob with the most neutral tone possible, and allowing 5 options from loving, liking, being indifferent, disliking, and hating the names of the Civ variants. I'd like to believe that my audience, you folks, are a good mix of casuals and enthusiasts, so I reckoned I'd get more balanced results and a better representation of the players overall. My poll also has over 2,300 votes, which is a much healthier population as well. The results, unsurprising to me, still leaned on folks who dislike the names. This is concerning because if the majority skews towards actively not liking it, then we know that there's a problem. The bigger issue, in my opinion, is that I don't believe that these votes are equal in weight. What I mean by this is the following. The average person will usually vote either neutrally or favorably towards any added value, even if the added value wasn't something they had in mind. For example, let's say that some players wanted the Spanish to be added as a new civilization, but we got the Byzantines instead. Very few of those players will actively dislike the Byzantines. They will either be neutral or they will still like it given that it's still a new civilization to play with even if it wasn't what they had in mind. On that note, let's take a look at another Reddit poll, which, again, is supposed to be on a biased population who will happily be contrarian. A very neutral question was posed. Now that the expansion has been revealed, what's your opinion? A healthy selection of options was provided, and out of over 1,000 votes, only 16 voted unfavorably. That's less than 2% dissatisfaction with the announced DLC so far, and they voted with the campaign and the Civ variants in mind, of course. As mentioned previously, I guarantee you that there were tons of players who wanted different civs to be added than the ones that were announced, but as you can see, only less than 2% actively disliked the announcements nevertheless. This goes back to my point earlier that players need to really dislike something to vote against it. If we ignore folks who voted being indifferent on my poll, then the 55% who voted that they disliked or hated the Civ variants is a much bigger deal than what the numbers tell us. This is not just, oh, more than half of the players don't like the Civ names. This is more like, wait, lots of players really don't like the Civ names to the point that it affects their enjoyment of the product. To summarize, it seems like 98% of the player base are happy to some capacity about everything announced so far, which is fantastic. However, a majority of the same player base specifically dislikes the variant Civ names. No matter which side you're on regarding this debate, this should not be ignored in my opinion. In a way, we can kind of draw parallels to the Zoom problem we had pre-launch. Some players were okay with it, but most weren't. And on that token, calling other players silly for caring about Civ names is also not productive. Let people care about what they care about. As long as there's healthy and non-abrasive discussion, players of all kinds should be able to voice their opinions without being dismissed. This is especially true because the numbers indicate that this noise is not created by a few mauling Redditors, but is a wide sentiment of the player base. I wouldn't have made a video about this otherwise. Okay, assuming the devs do make the decision to change the names, what should they be? Well, I admittedly haven't had the time to put much thought into it, but here are some quick suggestions. Jeanne d'Arc is the worst offender in my opinion, as it's literally the name of a person under what is supposed to be a civilization selection. This one's a bit tricky because she was born a peasant and wasn't under any house or nobility to name after. Something generic like House of Jeanne d'Arc or House of Orleans could be used perhaps, but I'm sure that someone can come up with a better name. Sultan's army is also too vague, so the Ayyubid dynasty or the Mamluk Empire perhaps could be used instead. Either would work well with the Crusader campaigns, especially since Baybars and Qutuz were named as the leaders that will play in the campaigns. Empire of Jade is not that straightforward, and I cannot discuss much due to the NDA. And finally, Order of the Dragon also doesn't sound too bad, but House of Luxembourg could be a better fit with the rest of the list overall. Again, I'm not married to any of these suggestions, and I'm sure that there are historians amongst us who can come up with the best names that thematically fits with the rest. Regardless, I think even these changes would suppress most concerns regarding the homogeny of the Civ names and put this thing behind us. Look, at the end of the day, my personal opinion doesn't matter and should be of no value to any one of you. I already voiced my concerns to the devs when I first saw the Civ names myself, but I'm just one person though. What really matters is what the majority of the player base wants, and the preliminary data and overall sentiment so far seems like it's in Microsoft's best interest to change the names before launch. On a final note, don't let this ruin your experience or hype for the DLC. Even if the names don't end up changing, it's ultimately you who will decide how much fun you want to have with the DLC. There are many things I'd rather change about the game myself. I personally would rather have different style icons, animated chicken and horses in the buildings, even more zoom options, a freaking scenario editor, and many more that would make my experience with the game much better. But I don't let those affect my enjoyment, and neither should you. By all means, voice your concerns with good, constructive language, and let the devs handle the rest. I promise you that they're reading all of this and are well aware of the discourse. They're great people who want the best for the game, and not everything is under their control. What's frustrating about this situation is that this one problem is currently overshadowing all of the amazing work and announcements of the DLC so far. It's unfortunate that this gets the spotlight for now, but I'm confident that this will just go away soon so that we can all focus on what matters: the amazing new civilizations, biomes, maps, campaigns, and a giant list of amazing improvements coming our way. As always, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to Age of Noob to not miss out on the long list of content I have planned for the DLC, and consider joining us as a member if you'd like to support me further. Take care, everyone. Remember to be kind with one another, even if we're all strangers on the internet, and see you all in the next one.